So the debate between Drace and I is coming to an end, and for my closing, I think I'm just going to address some of the last points that were made, and if I have any time, I'll say some other words that I kind of want to say, or maybe I'll try to make time for that anyways. There's this point about look, our feet, do they really touch the floor? Well, according to physics, they never truly do. On a microscopic scale, we're actually floating above the surface. It's the interaction of fields that creates this illusion of contact. So our senses do indeed deceive us. We feel as if our feet are touching the floor, but in reality, they are hovering slightly above it. This demonstrates that our perception of the world is often inaccurate. So let's not trust that. That is our perceptions. Drace mentioned alternatives to God for explaining the vastness of space. Well, even if that's true, my point isn't that people look at space and develop a rigorous argument concluding that God created it. Instead, they are often filled with an awe at what they see and instinctively attribute it to God. This sense of wonder might be why the universe is so vast, to show that its enormity does not negate the existence of God. Right, that was my point. My point was simply to show that the vastness of the universe does not negate the existence of God, because it could be so vast for the purpose of sending awe into our souls. Now, there's something before I might not have been so clear on, and that would just be my fault, I suppose. I don't see the problem with the vastness of time or our smallness in the universe. Our tiny existence is such a vast, cosmos, is awe-inspiring and encourages contemplation about the existence of God. For me, the argument loses its force if the goal is to prove that God is unreal. I don't think it entails a contradiction, that is, the vastness of time, our smallness in the universe. Regarding Drace's point about God being without a body, but having something akin to a mind, some atheist philosophers hold to panpsychism, the belief that mind is a fundamental aspect of the world. To my knowledge, no argument conclusively proves that mind cannot be a fundamental property of the universe. As long as it is possible for mind to exist on its own, it shouldn't pose a problem for God to be a mind without a body. Moreover, anything that God does, he does from eternity, including the incarnation. From his perspective, the assumption of human nature is a single eternal act. For us, it seems to occur at a specific time, but for God, there is no temporal sequence, only an ontological order, where the incarnation is not preceded by anything in time. So for God, it could be said that he's always been with the body, that is, Jesus Christ, the incarnation. Around 14 minutes into the discussion, Drace argues that there must be a physical basis for consciousness. But again, panpsychism remains a valid position because it suggests that mind can be fundamental, that is, a metaphysical property of the universe. So we have no reason to insist on a physical basis. The mind can exist as a property in and of itself. Drace then addresses the problem of evil, using a parent-child analogy. Sometimes a parent restricts a child's free will for their own good, but unlike the parent, God is all-knowing and sees the entire tapestry of time. If a parent understood that allowing their child to exercise free will and get into an accident would lead to a series of events culminating in the cure for cancer, they might allow the accident. Conversely, if stopping the accident would lead to worse outcomes, they might refrain from intervening. So God being all-knowing doesn't really play a role here. That is, it's not like, oh, well, it's worse because God knows everything. Well, no, it's not, because for the reasons I just stated. Even if the couple were all-knowing and can see into the future, and they can see that, oh, you know what, maybe we shouldn't intervene, because if we do, then he's never going to cure cancer. Now, who are we to claim that God never intervenes? Like once while riding my bike, I felt compelled to take a different route home, but I ignored the feeling. I hesitated, I slowed down, I thought about turning around, but continued on my path, and I was hit by a car. Luckily, I wasn't hurt, but the hesitation likely minimized the impact. Similarly, God might act in ways that prevent harm in ways that we just can't fully understand. We must consider the bigger picture. God sees the actions that help each of us grow spiritually, giving us the best chance to choose to be with him eternally. This is the best possible world, where the greatest number of free-willed beings choose God and experience everlasting happiness. Even if we can't comprehend it fully, we will, in eternity, look back and see this life as just a brief moment, a small, fleeting memory. Like, it'll be nothing. The suffering that we had in this one puny little expanse of time will be as just a faint, distant thing that is not that important to us anymore. Although right now it seems like all too important. I really actually appreciated the dark humor when Drace remarked that suffering isn't sufficient until you add Satan and his horde of or in his horde to terrorize humanity. I used to think like this, and I smiled because God saved me despite my former cynicism. I wanted to briefly touch on something that I don't really have time to get into now, but I do in my Theodicy. Drace mentioned that evolution wiped out 98% of species and involved suffering. True. But how much do these creatures really suffer? We often anthropomorphize animals and imagine that their suffering is similar to our own, but it's not. In my Theodicy, all animals enjoy heaven forever and undergo a different kind of soul-building process. He also asked whether people like Elie Wiesel might disagree about the amount of suffering being necessary. Of course, many will disagree because we can't see the entire picture of time and how everything fits together to maximize the good, where the greatest number of people choose God. It's the ultimate good, as being without God is far from ideal. Even if Wiesel claimed that he lost God forever, he couldn't know that for sure. We don't know the future. Jesus could have appeared to Wiesel just before his death, explaining everything in a way he needed to understand, leading him to accept and embrace God, even thanking him for the suffering, seeing that suffering as a small piece for the eternal bliss that waits ahead. It looks like I'll have some time for my closing after all. Drace questioned whether some people suffer more or less than needed for soul building. God places us where and when we need to be born, giving us the right opportunities to make choices that affect our growth. All souls are positioned on the timeline perfectly. We need not worry if some suffer too little or too much. God knows what he's doing. Again, I go into more details about this in my Theodicy. Finally, Drace raised the issue of infants who die young. He suggested that if a child can skip this life, God could create all souls this way, but this would negate free will. God, with his middle knowledge, see like Alvin Plantinga on free will, for example, he knows the choices that every soul would make. If a soul, like that of a child who dies young, would have chosen the right things without needing early experiences, then no additional soul building is necessary. Meanwhile, souls like Drace's or mine benefit from living longer, earthly lives. God knows precisely when and where each soul needs to be born, even those who die young. So no one suffers needlessly. With that being said, I just want to kind of speak from the heart a little bit for my closing, and that is that, one, I enjoyed the debate, and I thank Drace for participating in it, and I thank everyone who has taken the time to listen all the way to the end. If you're one of those people that at all are still thinking maybe God might be real, and you're feeling any sort of calling at all to reach out to God, like I was there at one time, but I thought God just seems so fake though. Even if you feel any little bit of movement or pull, you feel like maybe I should ask God, what if you're real? Just show me yourself or something like that. But you're that just seems silly and foolish. Why would I do that? Why would I ask God to do anything? I think God is like Santa Claus. Am I going to ask Santa Claus? I can't change my mind on that. Once you know Santa Claus is fake, then you know that Santa Claus is fake, right? There's no going back to belief in Santa Claus, and that's true, I think. But maybe try this, because this is what I tried. I said, God, if you're real, you know that I just don't believe in you. You know that you're as fake as Santa Claus to me, and I feel silly even asking this. I really feel like I'm talking to Santa right now. But nonetheless, if you're real, then you have the power to change me. You have the power to move me deeply. You know exactly what it takes to make me believe in you. So do that. And he did. To my surprise, because I thought nothing would happen, of course, he did. And he could do that for you too. Also, if maybe you think, well, maybe God's real, but this problem of evil just seems, insurmountable. it just pulls on your soul and it pulls on your emotions just too much. Maybe that's the same thing. But it's just like, man, this just seems the world just seems so bad. I highly recommend checking out my Theodicy. It's the thing that God gave me through a lot of great people. A lot of it comes from St. Thomas Aquinas. Some of it comes from other theologians and speakers all about this topic. But some of it is novel. Some of it I truly believe was inspired to me by the Holy Spirit. And it gives me a true sense of peace and understanding about why suffering is here. So maybe check that out. I'll link to it maybe I'll pin it as a comment at the top there. And I highly recommend reading that. It's not very long, and it's written in the way like Plato wrote. It's written as a dialogue. Ultimately, I think if it's going to be something purely logical at this point, if you have no experience of the supernatural or of God in any way, and it really just comes down to the logic of it, or maybe you do have some belief in God, but you're losing it, and you just need some good logical foundation. I think it comes down to metaphysics. What metaphysics is it that you hold to? What do you find most convincing? I highly recommend looking into scholasticism. Look into this idea that change is a potential being actualized by something that exists. And if that makes sense to you, that's what change is. Like, for example, if I have a match, it's unlit. That match has the potential to be lit on fire. However, it can't just light itself on fire. In this case, that's not a potential. It can actualize itself. And therefore, it needs something else that exists to actualize its potential. Something non-existent can't actualize its potential. Like if unicorns don't exist, a unicorn can't actualize the match's potential and cause it to be on fire. But something else can, such as a human being that has some rough substance like sandpaper. He can cause that match to to actualize its potential. There's really not a whole lot of other ideas of what change is exactly. Like, what is change in and of itself? One idea is by Alfred Whitehead, and hey, if that makes sense to you, this idea of process philosophy, that all thing is just constantly processing, and that's all that change is a fundamental thing in of itself. I think this has problems, but if that makes sense to you, okay, then go from there and see what that leads to. It still seems to lead to a God. But if you, like me, you start studying, like take seriously these ideas of what change actually is. And if you find that it just makes more sense that change is, in essence, what change is a potential being actualized, and therefore it has to be actualized by something real, that is, or in this case, something existent. Then look deeper into these kind of other things, these other implications that flow from this philosophy. But more importantly, look at the argument from change, because once you agree that that's what change is, then it seems a logical deduction that the argument from change goes through, and that leads you to that which is purely actual. And if you're led to that which is purely actual and therefore unchanging, because in order to change requires potential by the very definition of change that we have accepted, then God is this unchanging thing, this unchanging actualizer. And from there, you can deduce a lot of other things about him. You can deduce a lot of the other qualities about this entity, some of which Aristotle does in Metaphysics Book 12. And once you have that, well, then you logically have a foundation for God. From there, it's just trying to figure out, well, what else about God can you possibly know? And maybe that will lead you to want to pray more. And maybe God will come. Maybe Jesus will come. Or maybe, who knows, maybe you'll end up somewhere else. I feel that physicalism, at least for me, just doesn't offer anything that I find believable. I don't find it believable that emergent properties happen. Not emergent properties without any logical foundation. That is, you can have an emergent property like wetness emerge because it's not really a new thing. It's just a understanding of the things that are already there within the properties. They're not magically, by just forming together some collection of stuff, they're not just magically creating a property that just couldn't possibly exist. I don't think that's possible. To me, that is truly magical. That is magic without reason. That's like reading a novel where there's like magic, but they don't explain how that magic works or anything. And it just becomes unbelievable and silly. Magic can be reasonable if there's a logical foundation for how it functions, for how it works. And so my challenge remains to physicalism. That is, show us the logical foundation for awareness. You can start with any properties that you want to, any of them, and none of that has been done in this debate. Showing how we start from these larger functional things and saying, well, if they work together like this, then consciousness seems to be there. That's not an explanation, though. That's not what I'm asking for. I'm asking to start with the fundamental properties of physicalism, whatever that might be. It could be anything you want it to be, so long as it makes sense that it's physical. Maybe you have charge, maybe you have push and pull properties, maybe you have time and space, maybe you have dimensionality, whatever. Maybe you have duplication, multiplication, whatever. You have these fundamental principles that exist. Then show how, when they work together in such a way, it makes logical sense that we can all agree and see this is the result, awareness. I don't see it. All I see is that no matter what physical properties you have, you're just going to have mechanisms. You're going to have mechanics. You're going to have movement, sure. You'll have change, sure. Like you have the property of attraction. And you have things that can be attracted, and then they come together, and that's movement, and that's change. But that's just mechanism. That's just mechanics. There's no awareness there. And I don't see how any collection of these fundamental physical properties can possibly lead to awareness. By the way, this is why there are atheists that fully believe that consciousness is just its own property. It is a fundamental property. This typically is known as panpsychism, as I mentioned earlier. Atheists believe that because they see that there's no real foundation in physicalism. That is, there's no metaphysical foundation for consciousness. And it's a big problem for them, and that's why they believe in panpsychism. So with that, I'll come to a close. Thank you for listening.